Welcome to the very first episode of Heritage Storytime, Oney Judge's Daring Escape from Slavery. My name is Melissa. Heritage Storytime is a new virtual program presented by Global Philadelphia Association. Every month, we'll release a new episode where we'll read a book together and learn all about Philadelphia's heritage. Do you know what heritage means? Heritage is everything that we got from past generations that makes us who we are today. When we read stories about our heritage, we learn more about ourselves. And when we read stories about Philadelphia's heritage, we learn more about the city that we call home and everything that we share as a community. That's what Heritage Storytime is all about.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Today we're going to hear a story about a very important woman. Her name was Oney Judge, and she lived here in Philadelphia in the late 1700s when Philadelphia was the capital of the United States. She was a slave in the household of President Washington, and when she was in her early 20s, she made a very important decision. She decided to run away, and she did. So we're going to hear about what it was like to be a slave when our country was new and when she ran away from Philadelphia to New Hampshire and lived the rest of her life there. The title of the book is My Name is Oney Judge. The author is Dr. Diane Turner, the illustrator was Cal Massey, and the press is the Third World Press.
Hi, my name is Hannah Wallace, and on behalf of the African American Museum in Philadelphia, I invite you to check out our programs, exhibitions, and stories that are held within our halls. If you cannot join us physically, please check out our online resources. The African American Museum in Philadelphia commits itself to preserving the stories of African Americans in all its permutations. Thank you.
My Name is Oney Judge by Dr. D. Turner. My name is Oney Judge. I took my freedom. All my life I hungered for freedom. One day I took my freedom. This is my story. I was born Ona Maria Judge during slavery times about the year 1774. Everybody started calling me Oney Judge. I was born during the time of the American Revolution. In 1770, an African named Crispus Attucks was the first to fall at the Boston Massacre. I also learned that Africans from Haiti came to America with General Lafayette and fought for American freedom. I guess that is why I always yearned for freedom. A year before my birth in 1773, Phyllis Wheatley, the first African and the second American woman to publish a book, published with her book called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. This was remarkable because most blacks were prohibited from learning how to read or write, especially enslaved Africans. Reading and writing became a major form of African resistance to slavery. It showed that we had just as much intelligence as anyone else. We were also able to let our feelings be known about the founding fathers of the United States who expressed their passion for liberty and freedom, yet kept us enslaved. I am the daughter of Betty and Andrew Judge. My father was an English tailor. My mother was a beautiful African seamstress. She was called a mulatto, and so was I. You were called a mulatto when one of your parents was African or Indian and the other was European. Name calling was used to separate and divide people from each other. It might sound crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. Besides being called mulattoes, we were also called dower slaves. Dower slaves meant that we were the property of the wife passed on by her husband after his death. I was considered the property of Mrs. Martha Washington's first husband's estate, Daniel Parke Custis. But I am a child of God. I never considered myself nobody's property. My father and my mother lived and worked on Mr. George and Mrs. Martha Washington's plantation in Mount Vernon, Virginia. To control enslaved Africans in Virginia, slave codes were passed that gave the so-called slave owners unlimited power. For example, Slave owners would not be taken to court for the casual killing of slaves. Slave codes were strictly enforced. The lawmakers started calling Africans blacks and calling Europeans whites. Reference to slavery entered into Virginia law as early as 1661. It became illegal for blacks and whites to get married. President Washington never acknowledged me as being the child of my father because he was considered white. A slave code was passed in Virginia around 1662 that stated children would follow the status of their mothers. By law, I followed the status of my mother. My dear mother was forced to serve the President and Mrs. Washington for her entire life. My mother and every child that she birthed would never be free. But since I can remember, I always wanted for my freedom. The so-called slave codes were used to justify our enslavement and treat us different from the whites, like we were less than human. My English father had the status of an indentured servant. He was required to work for the Washingtons, but only for a certain amount of time. Once he satisfied his contract, he was free. You might not believe it, but back in those days, white folks involved in slavery thought it was black folks' natural place to wait on them hand and foot and be their slaves. But I ain't no slave. I never was. When I was a little girl, I was very smart. Miss Martha said that I was a quick learner. My mother taught me to be very polite. Miss Martha noticed me and decided to make me her attendant when I was about 10 years old. I was assigned to work directly for Miss Martha. They took me from the slave quarters into the mansion at Mount Vernon. Most of the time, I was very busy with my chores. Sometimes I got to keep company with Miss Martha's granddaughter, Nellie Custis. I enjoyed my time with Nellie. Still, I was unhappy. She was free, but I was not. Just like my mother, I was good with my hands and liked to sew. She taught me how to do needlework. I became quite good at it. Some people called me an expert. I didn't care about being no expert. I wanted my freedom. Miss Martha was quite fond of me, so people said. She chose me to be her body servant when Mr. Washington was elected president on April 14, 1789. I was responsible for the care of Miss Martha's clothes and hair. I was about 16 years old by this time. Some of the enslaved Africans envied my position. They whispered that they would be delighted to serve Miss Martha, but I really didn't care about my position. I wanted something more. I wanted my freedom. In April 1789, the President and Miss Martha took me and 7 other enslaved Africans up north to New York City. Mole, Hercules, Richmond, Giles, Paris, Christopher Sheets, my brother Alston, and me were chosen to serve the Washingtons at their new residential palace. I had heard about the North. There was a lot of encoded language and passing of information among enslaved Africans. On the Mount Vernon plantation, Samuel Anderson lived with us. They called him a saltwater Negro because he came straight from Africa. He had beautiful markings on his face that identified what nation he came from. He used to tell us stories about Africa. Those of us who had African blood were proud of it. We all wanted our freedom. During my travels in the North, all I could think about was freedom. About November 1790, the Washingtons moved from New York City to Philadelphia, the new capital. They decided to take us with them instead of sending us back to Mount Vernon. We stayed at 190 High Street. Some people thought I had it pretty good for an enslaved woman. Miss Martha took me with her on shopping trips and on social visits. She brought me things, too. None of this really mattered to me. I did not want anything except my freedom. Philadelphia was called the city of brotherly love. It was very different from Virginia, and even New York. The state of Pennsylvania passed a law that stated enslaved Africans who resided in the state for 6 months became free. President Washington used to send some of the enslaved Africans back and forth between Pennsylvania and Virginia so that he didn't lose control of any of his valuable enslaved Africans. There was lots of excitement in Philadelphia. They had an abolitionist movement going on. The abolitionists were both black and white, male and female. They protested against slavery. When I found out, my heart raced. I knew that I was in the right place to talk about my freedom. The free black community in Philadelphia had many prominent people like Sarah and Richard Allen, Mary and Absalom Jones, James Dexter, and James Forten. There were so many beautiful blacks, I cannot recall them all. They even had an organization called the Free African Society. Learning all of this gave me a sense of pride and determination to get free. I secretly made friends with some free blacks. They were very dignified, spiritual people. They did not take their freedom for granted. More importantly, they were very nice to me. I told them that I wanted my freedom. They assured me that they would help me get my freedom. They helped me plan my escape. They were wonderful. For that moment, I loved every one of them for the rest of my life. I could taste my freedom. In 1796, the Washingtons planned to travel back to Virginia. While as they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I could never get my liberty. I escaped one night in May 1796 when the President and Miss Martha were eating their dinner. My friends gave me some blankets to keep me warm. I disguised myself as a woman, much heavier than I really was. They put me on a merchant ship named Nancy, heading farther north. The ship was commanded by Captain John Bowles of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I was very scared. I knew that if I got caught, the punishment would be horrible. I was terrified by the thought of being whipped, but my thoughts of freedom were greater than my fear of the consequences. I was concealed in the hold of the ship for the entire trip, about 4 or 5 days. I was wrapped up in blankets, but was still very cold. I could not tell if it was day or night. The trip was rocky. I got sick. I wasn't sure if my sickness came from the excitement of getting closer to my freedom or the rocking of the ship. At times, I felt like I was going to faint, but a voice inside me said, "Hold on, Oney, freedom is near." I finally arrived at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's where I claimed my freedom. I was still at risk because slavery was considered legal in New Hampshire. It was a very dangerous situation. Slavery did not end in New Hampshire until 1857. Through God's grace and the help of my angels, I was able to take my precious freedom. I tasted the sweet air around me and shouted, "Hallelujah." That was the joy of my life, my freedom. My new friends took real good care of me. There was an African community in Portsmouth with people like Coffee Whipple. Mr. Whipple was the brother of Prince Whipple, an African Revolutionary War veteran. More than 5,000 Africans served in the Revolutionary War. It was discovered by a friend of the Washingtons in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Later, I learned that Miss Martha was very upset. She could not believe that I left her like I did. She thought that I had been kidnapped or charmed away by a Frenchman. She told people she was very good to me. That did not matter to me. She still thought I was her property. I ain't nobody's property. God made me to be free. There is nothing like freedom. Miss Martha demanded that the president get me back. President Washington had signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 before I escaped. I was residing in the president's house in Philadelphia when he signed it. The shame of it all. The same place where I heard the president and other founding fathers talk about freedom. The law made it a crime for enslaved Africans to take their freedom. The law also made it a crime for people to help us, to hide us, or to prevent our arrests. The law did not stop me. It made me want my freedom even more. God knows I missed my mother, my brother, and other family members, but as an enslaved girl, I spent most of my time away from my family anyway. I had to tend to Miss Martha. There was no going back for me. For the rest of my natural life, I had to protect myself from slave catchers. I did not care. I was free. After I was cited by the Washington's friend, word got back to them that I was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Several attempts were made to get me back to the Washingtons. President Washington wrote a letter to his Treasury Secretary, Oliver Wolcott. He wrote this about me: the ingratitude of the girl who was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant, and Mrs. Washington's desire to recover her ought not to escape with impunity if it can be avoided. President Washington and Miss Martha were shocked when they found out that I took my freedom. I even tried to negotiate with the president. I told him that I would return if and only if he granted my freedom upon his death and Miss Martha's. I thought that my terms were very reasonable. He did not. I heard that he was quite angry, so the president hunted me until his death. I lived 75 good years. I spent my life free from the age of 23 to 75 years of age. It was not easy for free blacks. We faced racial prejudice. We had difficulties earning a living. Still, life was good. God gave me freedom. God gave me a husband named James Staines. He was a mariner. God gave me 3 beautiful children that were named Eliza, Nancy, and William. I became known as Ona Maria Judge Staines. I was respectable, free, a free woman, wife, and mother. I learned that President Washington died on December 14, 1799. In his will, he said that his slaves would be free upon the death of his wife. Mrs. Martha Washington freed all of the enslaved Africans in 1880. I learned later that my dear sister, Philadelphia Judge, married Miss Martha's grandson, William Custon, who was also called a mulatto that same year. Mrs. Martha died on May 22nd, 1802. The good Lord took me on home from Greenland, New Hampshire, on February 25th, 1848. I went on up to the promised land. Please, children, remember me. When you think about freedom, when you talk about freedom, my name is Oney Judge. I took my precious freedom.
My name is Gwen Ragsdale, and I'm the Executive Director and Curator of Lest We Forget Museum of Slavery, located 5501 Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're the only slavery museum in Philadelphia and the only museum with actual slavery artifacts. Our objects are proof positive of how different coming to America was for millions of enslaved Africans. You will have an opportunity to see some of these documents. As I mentioned, Lest We Forget Slavery Museum has an extensive number of slavery artifacts. It was this shackle that my husband, J. Justin Ragsdale, the founder and the collector of all of these items, found in his uncle's trunk. This shackle is very rare, and it's also very heavy. This would go around the neck of an enslaved male. It has a leather piece inside of this, but it's not for the comfort of the slave. It's to keep him from getting any marks around his neck, because if he was all dinged up, he would lose value. Remember, we were property, and as such, we were treated as such. This is about 15 pounds, but this part, this heavy iron ball, is 40 pounds of pure iron. Now, I'm shorter than the average male, but look at where this would hit the male if he tried to run away. These are some of the artifacts that you will see when you visit the Lest We Forget Slavery Museum. These are actual Middle Passage shackles. These shackles were used on the slave ships to restrain the enslaved Africans that they stole from Africa. This shackle would go around the ankles of enslaved males. If they didn't have enough to go around, one of these shackles would come off and go around the ankle of one male slave, and the other one would come off and go around the ankle of another male slave. Auctions were a major event during slavery, where millions or hundreds of people would come to attend these auctions, where black human beings were being sold like chattel property. They actually had signs around the area, and they would have a slave go around ringing a bell early in the morning announcing the fact that there's going to be an auction today. This one reads, Negroes to be sold, and it was conducted at a high school, sponsored by the student council and faculty. Imagine that. Sometimes they would list the names of the slaves who were being sold, like this one, the girl Betsy. Betsy is a very likely girl, large, intelligent, handy, and healthy. She's acquainted with all kinds of housework and is a good breeder. I like to point out this image here. This shows you an enslaved woman begging for her child to be given back after it was snatched right from her arms and sold away. This happened over and over again. This is an actual child's leg shackle. It's hard to comprehend something that could be used on a child so small to keep it from crawling or toddling away. It was against the law for slaves to marry, but they would have secret ceremonies where they would jump the broom, a tradition that they brought from their African culture. And they would say vows that included in sickness and in health or separation. We've dropped the separation part because we're no longer being auctioned off. But again, it's important to recognize that this is a result of slavery. This is an actual auction shackle that was used on the auction block. It reads, Goldman and Sons, Slave Auctions, Atlanta, Georgia, 1853. Again, these iron objects were used on human beings who were sold like chattel property. It's important to recognize that enslaved African women produced capital not only with their hands, but also with their wombs, because any child that they had were automatically enslaved. This is an image of a slave girl who was forced to wear a mask as she worked in the kitchen because she wasn't allowed to eat the food or even taste the food. Imagine working in a hot kitchen with this large metal mask on your face. This is what some of the slave women were subjected to. This image is of a slave woman with a collar around her neck, similar to this brass female collar that would be given to a well-to-do white mistress who owned her. When she took her slave girl to town, she would put this collar around her neck, attach a leash to it, and pull her slave girl behind her as if she were a pet. Again, imagine how humiliating that had to be for that slave girl. Many slaves ran away, but they were usually caught. Because if you were black and in America, you would stick out like a sore thumb, and more than likely people would know that you were a slave. So they would bring you back and they would put this around your ankle. And every time you moved, they could hear you. They have little iron balls on the inside. This one makes an even louder sound. It has ringlets on the outside. And they had specially trained dogs that were trained to do nothing but catch runaway slaves. Let's talk about the Underground Railroad, which of course wasn't a real railroad. It was a network of compassionate whites and freed and enslaved blacks who worked together to abolish slavery. The story of Oney Judge talks about her escape from slavery right in Philadelphia. She was able to escape, but she never felt free. And it was because of this law, the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to put a bounty on their fugitive slaves and they could come after you. So just imagine, you've escaped slavery and you've been free for 2 years, 2 months, 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 minutes, and then someone could come and take you back into slavery. So you may not have ever been caught, but as in the case with Oney Judge, she never felt free. There were many conductors that were a part of the Underground Railroad, like this man, Levi Coffin, who was a Quaker and an abolitionist. He was a wealthy man and he didn't believe in slavery. As a matter of fact, he lived near the Ohio River. He would hide slaves in his house during the day, and at night, he would have the slaves taken down to the river, put in boats, and rowed across the Ohio River into Canada where they could be freed. Then there was this man, Frederick, who was born into slavery. His slave mistress, the woman who owned him, taught him how to read the Bible when he was just a young boy. But he wanted so much to learn that sometimes he would steal bread from the kitchen and run down to the road and wait for the poor white children to come home from school. And he would say, "I'll give you a piece of bread if you teach me everything that you learned in school today." That's how much he wanted to be educated. Then there was this man who was considered the father of the Underground Railroad, William Still. William Still worked tirelessly to match fugitive slaves with the conductors, and he kept the names of all of the slaves who came through his office because he knew that at one point these slaves would want to be reunited with their families. The woman who was responsible for bringing all of these slaves to Philadelphia to freedom was none other than Harriet Tubman. Harriet was a fierce abolitionist, but she didn't learn how to read or write. She was illiterate most of her life, but she did learn how to write her name. This is her actual signature. She had nice penmanship, didn't she? She was very proud of the fact that she never lost a passenger. And she said that she could have saved more slaves if they knew they were slaves. What she meant by that is if my mother was a slave and her mother before her was a slave and her mother before her was a slave, as a slave, all you knew how to do is be a slave. Even when she took her brother on one of her treks to freedom, he got scared midway and wanted to go back to the plantation. But she threatened to kill him because she did not want him to go back into slavery. Not only was George Washington a slave owner, 12 of our presidents were slave owners. Thomas Jefferson, Monroe, Jackson, and many more. But George Washington owned Oney Judge. And when she ran away, he and Martha could not understand why she had run away because they felt that they had treated her so kindly. As a matter of fact, Martha was so disturbed, she said, "I've owned her all her life. I treated her like a sister." But what they failed to understand is that what was most important to Oney was her freedom. That's what she wanted more than anything else, was her freedom, and that's why she ran away. The stories that I've shared with you are just a few of the many stories that you would hear when you come and visit us at the Lest We Forget Slavery Museum. Again, we're located at 5501 Germantown Avenue, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 19144. We're open by appointment Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Just give us a call at 215-205-4324 or go to our website, www.l-w-f-as-in-forget-s-as-in-slavery-museum.com and book a tour. We hope to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Here in Philadelphia, We're really fortunate to have so many different ways to learn about African American history in our city, going all the way back to the 1600s and the 1700s. We were just visiting with Gwen Ragsdale at the Lest We Forget Museum of Slavery in Germantown, and she showed us a lot of the artifacts and documents that she and her husband have collected over so many years. We can learn about the people who were the victims of the institution of slavery through her museum. We'd like to thank that museum. We'd like to thank everyone here at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and also Dr. Diane Turner at Temple University's Bloxham Collection. There's lots more information and activities about Oney Judge and about the themes in her book at our learnphillyheritage.org website.
If you enjoyed this episode of Heritage Storytime and would like to see future programming like this, please consider donating to Global Philadelphia Association by texting GPA Storytime to 41444. This episode of Heritage Storytime will be available to stream online soon at learnphillyheritage.org/stories. We will have future episodes of Heritage Storytime available to you, and if you want to hear about those, you can sign up for our mailing list. The link to the mailing list is on the Learn Philly Heritage website. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learning all about Oney Judge and her daring escape from slavery. Thank you for joining us.